The gate clicked shut with a finality that echoed in my chest. It wasn't a polite closing. It was a barrier, slammed into place with the precision of a guillotine. Stephanie stood on the other side, framed by the sleek, minimalist gray slate of her patio. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. That was worse. Anger implies passion. Boredom implies you are beneath notice. "Sorry, Alexis," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any real apology. She gestured vaguely at my clothes, my worn denim apron, the dirt under my fingernails, the basket of fresh basil I was holding like an offering. "But look at you. We're hosting the inner circle tonight. These are serious people, investors, brand partners." She paused, letting her eyes drift over me again, dissecting me. "Honestly, you're just off-brand." She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back, the silk of her blouse catching the late afternoon sun, and walked away. I stood there, staring at the painted wood of the fence that separated our townhouses. Off-brand. That was the verdict. Not "we don't have room," not "maybe next time." I was a contaminant, a visual error in her carefully curated life. My husband, Mason, was standing 10 feet away on her patio. He had watched the whole thing. He was holding a glass of expensive wine, his back stiff. He saw his sister humiliate his wife, lock a gate in her face, and tell her she wasn't good enough to be seen. And he did nothing. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just took a sip of wine and turned to laugh at something a guest was saying. That silence was louder than the gate slamming. It vibrated in the air between us. For years, I had told myself it was just family dynamics, that Stephanie was difficult, and Mason was a peacekeeper. But standing there, smelling the exhaust from the luxury cars lining the street and the faint, sterile scent of Stephanie's expensive catering, I realized the truth. He wasn't keeping the peace. He was keeping his position. I looked down at the basil in my hands. It was vibrant green, smelling of earth and summer rain. It was real. Everything on the other side of that fence, the gray furniture, the catered food, the forced laughter, felt like a stage set. And I had just been fired from the production. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't knock on the gate. I didn't call Mason's name. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction they could label emotional or hysterical. Instead, I turned around and walked 5 measured steps back to the center of my yard. My movements were calm, deliberate. I set the basil basket down on the reclaimed wood table Mason had helped me build 2 years ago, back when he still pretended to care about this life we were building. Then I went to the woodpile. I selected 3 pieces of seasoned oak, the kind that burns hot and clean. I carried them to the stone pizza oven, the one I had designed and constructed myself over 3 grueling weekends last summer. It stood in the corner of the garden like a dormant volcano, its curved dome covered in a mosaic of broken tiles I'd scavenged from renovation sites. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't minimalist. It was solid, heavy, and undeniably present. I stacked the wood inside, added kindling, and struck a match. The fire caught instantly, a bright orange tongue licking at the darkness of the oven's interior. Smoke curled upward, carrying the rich, unmistakable scent of burning oak. It wasn't an aggressive act, technically. It was just dinner preparation. But in the context of the sterile, silent evening unfolding 10 feet away, it was a declaration of war. Stephanie's patio was a study in gray. Gray slate tiles, gray wicker furniture, gray cushions. Even the food looked monochromatic, tiny, perfectly arranged appetizers on rectangular white platters. It was quiet over there, a hushed, reverent silence, as if they were in a museum rather than a home. My side of the fence was alive. The fire crackled and popped, a cheerful, primal sound that cut through the polite murmurs of Stephanie's guests. The heat began to radiate outward, pushing back the evening chill. I walked to the vertical garden wall I'd installed along the fence line, a riot of green ferns, trailing ivy, and herbs. I began to harvest more basil, tearing the leaves with a satisfying snap, releasing their peppery fragrance into the air. I saw Mason turn his head. He looked at the smoke rising from my oven, then at the firelight dancing on the leaves of my garden. For a second, I saw a flicker of longing in his eyes. He loved my pizza. He loved the way I made the dough from scratch, letting it rise for 48 hours until it was full of complex, yeasty flavor. He loved the way we would sit by the fire with a bottle of cheap red wine and talk until midnight. But then Stephanie said something sharp and low, and Mason flinched. He turned his back on me, on the fire, on the warmth, and returned his attention to the inner circle. He chose the cold, gray perfection over the messy, vibrant reality of his own home. Why does he do it? The question had haunted me for years, but tonight, staring at his rigid back, the answer finally crystallized. It wasn't just weakness, it was training. Mason had been raised in a household where love was a currency, dispensed only when you performed correctly. Stephanie, the older sister, had mastered the art of dispensing it. She had groomed him to believe that her approval was the sun, and he was just a planet orbiting her brilliance. He didn't stand up to her because, in his mind, she was the authority. To challenge her was to risk exile. He wasn't keeping the peace. He was paying rent for his place in the family hierarchy. And tonight, the cost of that rent was his wife. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. If he wanted to live in the gray, he could. But I wasn't going to let my world turn colorless just to match his. Inside, the dough was waiting. I dusted the wooden peel with flour. I started chopping garlic, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the knife echoing in the quiet evening. I wasn't just making dinner anymore. I was building a signal fire. The first person to look over the fence wasn't a guest. It was Mrs. Patricia. She lived in the end unit, a sprawling, eccentric structure covered in wisteria vines that seemed to defy the neighborhood's strict aesthetic codes. Mrs. Patricia was a recluse, a woman rumored to have more money than God and less patience than a cat in a bathtub. She rarely spoke to anyone, but she was always watching. Tonight, she was leaning over the top of my vertical garden, her silver hair wild in the breeze, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. "Is that oak?" she barked, her voice gravelly. I looked up from my dough, startled. "Yes, ma'am. Seasoned oak." She grunted, her eyes fixing on the pizza I was sliding into the oven. "And that basil, did you grow it?" "I did," I said, pride swelling in my chest. "From seed. It's a Genovese variety my grandmother used to grow." Mrs. Patricia stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked past me, through the gaps in the ivy, at Stephanie's patio. The contrast was stark. Over there, people stood in stiff clusters, balancing tiny plates of cold canapes, their laughter polite and brittle. The lighting was harsh, designed for Instagram photos rather than intimacy. It was a showroom, not a gathering. Here, the firelight danced on the leaves of the tomato plants, casting warm, flickering shadows. The air smelled of wood smoke, yeast, and melting mozzarella. It was messy. There were bags of flour on the table and bowls of sauce, but it was alive. "My grandmother grew Genovese basil," Mrs. Patricia said softly, her gaze returning to me, "in a pot on a fire escape in Queens. It was the only green thing we saw all summer. She didn't ask if she could come over. She just walked to the gate that separated her yard from mine, unlatched it, and stepped through. She was wearing a silk kimono that looked like it had been wrestled from a museum exhibit, and slippers that cost more than my car. She pulled up a mismatched garden chair, sat down at my flour-dusted table, and waited. She wasn't the only one. My daughter, Haley, came out the back door. She was 10, an age where the world is usually starting to feel too small. But in this garden, she expanded. She didn't care about Stephanie's brand, she cared about the alchemy of flour and water. She washed her hands in the outdoor sink and wordlessly took her place beside me, punching down a ball of dough with a satisfying whump. "Can I do the pepperoni?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You can do whatever you want," I told her. "It's your kitchen." We worked in a rhythm, the three of us. Me sliding pizzas in and out of the heat, Haley arranging toppings with artistic precision, Mrs. Patricia tearing hunks of crust and eating them with her eyes closed, murmuring approval. It wasn't just dinner. It was a reclaiming of space. Stephanie had tried to define worthy as exclusive, expensive, and sterile. But as the smell of baking bread drifted over the fence, I saw heads turning on her patio. I saw guests pausing mid-sentence, their nostrils flaring. I saw a young couple near the edge of the property glance at their tiny, cold appetizers and then look longingly at the steam rising from my oven. This garden wasn't just a patch of dirt. It was a third place, that rare, elusive sanctuary between work and home where community happens naturally. Stephanie was hosting a networking event. I was hosting a life. Mason was still over there, trapped in the gray. But the barrier between our worlds was thinning. The smoke from my fire didn't respect property lines. It drifted across the fence, carrying the scent of something real into the heart of Stephanie's artificial kingdom. And judging by the way her guests were starting to shift and whisper, they were starving for it. Stephanie's patience broke, not with a shout, but with a text. My phone buzzed on the flour-dusted table. "Can you tone it down? We're trying to have a conversation over here." I looked at the screen, then at Mason. He was standing by the punch bowl, his back to me, typing furtively. He wouldn't even look at me. He was delivering his sister's orders like a dutiful soldier. "Tone what down?" I muttered to myself. "The joy?" The text went unanswered. Haley was laughing at something Mrs. Patricia had said, a deep, belly-shaking laugh that was the best sound in the world. I wasn't going to silence my daughter to accommodate Stephanie's ego. 5 minutes later, the escalation began. "It smells like burning fat," Stephanie announced loudly. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. She was performing for her audience. She wrinkled her nose delicately, waving a hand in front of her face. "Mason, darling, could you go check? I think the neighbors are burning garbage again." The neighbors. Not Alexis, not his wife, the neighbors. Mason walked to the fence. He looked tired. His tie was loosened, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Alexis," he said, his voice low. "Steph says the smoke is bothering the guests. Can you put it out?" I looked at the fire, burning clean and bright. "It's oak, Mason. It smells like a campfire. And we're cooking dinner." "Can't you cook inside?" he hissed. "This is important. That guy over there, the one in the blue suit, that's Marcus Thorne, the food critic. Stephanie is trying to get him to feature her design firm in his lifestyle column." Marcus Thorne. I glanced over. A man in a sharp blue suit was standing near the edge of the patio, looking bored. He was holding a canapé like it was a dead insect. "If she wants to impress a food critic," I said evenly, "maybe she should have served him hot food." Mason's face tightened. "Just put it out, Alexis. Please. For me." "No," I said. "For you, I would do a lot of things. But I won't make myself small, so your sister can feel big. Not anymore." He stared at me, stunned. I had never said no to him like that, not when it came to Stephanie. He opened his mouth to argue, but Stephanie's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Oh, forget it, Mason." She strode over, her heels clicking aggressively on the slate. She stood next to him, glaring over the fence. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, addressing her guests. "So sorry, everyone. It's just a little rustic next door." Some people don't understand neighborhood covenants about open fires and sanitation. She pulled out her phone. The flash went off, blindingly bright in the twilight. She took a photo of me, apron stained with flour, hair messy, holding a pizza peel. Posting this to the neighborhood watch group, she announced cheerfully, caption, "When the neighborhood eyesore ruins your evening." Mrs. Patricia stood up slowly. She wiped tomato sauce from her lip with a silk napkin. "Sanitation?" she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. Stephanie blinked, noticing Mrs. Patricia for the first time. "Oh, hello, I didn't see you there. You really shouldn't be eating that, whatever it is. It's not safe." "It's pizza," Mrs. Patricia said. "And it's the best thing I've eaten in 20 years. Unlike those frozen quiches you're serving." Stephanie's smile faltered. "Those are artisanal tartlets. They're cardboard," Mrs. Patricia snapped. "And your wine is corked." The silence on the patio was absolute. Marcus Thorne, the food critic, turned his head. He looked at Stephanie, then at the fence, then at Mrs. Patricia. And for the first time all night, he looked interested. The mood on Stephanie's patio shifted instantly. The air, previously thick with polite boredom, crackled with tension. Marcus Thorne had taken a step closer to the fence, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Patricia. Stephanie noticed. Her eyes darted between the food critic and the eccentric neighbor, calculating. She realized she was losing control of the room, losing the narrative she had so carefully constructed. Panic flared in her eyes, sharp and desperate. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, pulling out her phone again. "I'm calling the HOA president. And the city, running an unlicensed restaurant in a residential zone is illegal. Alexis, you know that." She held the phone up like a weapon, thumb hovering over the screen, shut it down. "Now, or I report you for commercial zoning violations. Do you have any idea what the fines are?" "Thousands. They'll put a lien on your house." The threat hung in the air, heavy and metallic. The guests murmured, uncomfortable. Mason looked at me, his eyes pleading, "Just stop, please." But I didn't stop. I felt a cold calm wash over me, the same focus I used when calculating rise times for dough or pruning tomato vines. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the fence. "Go ahead," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence it carried perfectly. "Call them." Stephanie blinked. "Excuse me?" "Call the city," I repeated. "I know the codes, Stephanie. I checked them before I laid the first brick of this oven. Portland City Code, Title 33. This is a private residence. I am not charging anyone money. I am not advertising. I am feeding my family and my neighbors." I gestured to Mrs. Patricia, to Haley, to the couple from 3 doors down who had just wandered into the yard, drawn by the smell. "This is a dinner party," I said, "just like yours. Except mine doesn't violate Section 14 regarding commercial gatherings in residential zones." Stephanie froze. "What are you talking about?" "Your event planner," I said, pointing to the woman in black hovering by the catering trays. "Your paid staff. The ticketed entry for charity you mentioned in the invite to get around the guest limit rules. Technically, Stephanie, you are the one running an unlicensed commercial event, and if you call the city on me, I will be very happy to show them the invite you sent out." The color drained from Stephanie's face. She looked at Marcus Thorne, who was now suppressing a smile. She looked at her guests, who were suddenly very interested in their shoes. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I would," I said. "You wanted to talk about rules? Let's talk about rules. You don't get to use the law as a stick to beat me with just because you're losing the popularity contest." The smell of burning bridges filled the air, acrid and final. I had just publicly humiliated her in front of the very people she lived to impress. I had exposed her hypocrisy, and I didn't regret a single second of it. Stephanie stood there, phone still raised, mouth opening and closing. She looked at Mason, expecting him to step in, to defend her, to restore the order, but Mason wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me. And for the first time in years, he didn't look like a little brother afraid of his big sister. He looked like a man waking up from a long, gray sleep. "She's right, Steph," he said quietly. Stephanie whipped around. "What did you say?" "She's right," Mason repeated, his voice gaining strength. "You're charging a donation fee at the door. Alexis is just cooking." The betrayal hit Stephanie like a physical blow. She staggered back a step, her perfect composure shattering. And in that moment of weakness, the dam broke. Marcus Thorne, the illustrious food critic, cleared his throat. He set his untouched plate of cold tartlets on a gray side table. He smoothed his blue suit, and then, with the grace of a man deciding to leave a sinking ship, he walked toward the fence. "Excuse me?" he said to me, his voice rich and amused. "Is that sourdough crust?" Marcus Thorne didn't just walk to the fence, he vaulted it. For a man in a tailored suit, he moved with surprising agility. He swung one long leg over the low barrier, then the other, landing softly on my mulch. He didn't look back at Stephanie. He walked straight to the table where Mrs. Patricia was holding a slice of pepperoni pizza, like it was a sacred artifact. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the pizza peel. "Be my guest," I said, handing him a fresh slice. He took a bite. He closed his eyes. A slow, contented sigh escaped him. "My God," he murmured. "The fermentation on this dough, it's perfect. 48 hours, cold ferment, I confirmed. San Marzano tomatoes, oak fire. It's brilliant," he said, opening his eyes and smiling at me. "Absolutely brilliant. Do you have any wine? Real wine?" "Boxed red," Mrs. Patricia offered, pouring him a generous glass in a mason jar. "But it hasn't been sitting in the sun for 3 hours." On the other side of the fence, the dam burst. Stephanie stood frozen, watching her prize guest defect to the peasant side. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The remaining guests looked at each other, then at the empty platters of cold appetizers, then at the warm, glowing party next door. One by one, they started moving. First, the young couple I'd noticed earlier. They stepped tentatively to the gate. Is it okay if we join?" the woman asked. "Everyone is welcome," I said. Gates unlocked. Then another couple, then 3 more. Within minutes, Stephanie's patio was emptying out. People were abandoning the gray silence for the laughter and warmth of my garden. They sat on the grass, on overturned buckets, on the retaining wall. Haley was handing out slices as fast as I could bake them. The air was filled with chatter and the clinking of jars. Stephanie was left standing alone in the center of her perfect empty stage. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She looked furious, humiliated, and utterly defeated. But the final blow didn't come from the guests. It came from Mason. He hadn't crossed the fence yet. He was standing near the catering table, staring down at something on the ground. It was a piece of paper, thick and cream-colored, that must have fallen from Stephanie's clutch during her tirade. He picked it up, he read it, and then he went very, very still. "Steph," he said. His voice was strange, hollow. She whipped her head around, her eyes wild. "What? What is it now?" "This isn't an invoice for an event planner," Mason said, holding up the paper. "It's a final notice from a collections agency." Stephanie lunged for it, but he held it out of reach. "Give me that!" "It says you're 3 months behind on the lease for your office," Mason read, his voice rising in disbelief. "And there's another one here. Credit card debt? $50,000? He looked up at her, his face pale in the harsh patio lights. "Stephanie, you told me your firm was having its best quarter ever. You told me you needed that loan from our joint savings for expansion." "It is expansion," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's an investment. You have to spend money to make money. Mason. You wouldn't understand. I understand that you lied to me, he said. You took our family money for Haley's college fund to pay for this. He gestured at the abandoned catering trays, the rented furniture, the gray facade. For a party to impress people who don't even like you? I did it for the family brand, she screamed. I did it for us. No, Mason said. You did it for you. Because you're terrified that if you stop pretending to be rich, people will realize you're just empty. It was the most brutal, honest thing he had ever said to her. The silence that followed was absolute. The guests in my garden stopped chewing. Marcus Thorne lowered his wine glass. Even Mrs. Patricia looked solemn. Stephanie stood there, stripped bare. Her elitism, her cruelty, her obsession with brands and image, it wasn't strength. It was a frantic, expensive costume she wore to hide the fact that she was drowning. She wasn't a queen holding court. She was a bankrupt fraud throwing a party on a sinking ship. Mason dropped the paper. It fluttered to the gray slate like a white flag. He turned his back on his sister, walked to the fence, unlatched the gate, and stepped through. He didn't look at me. He looked at the ground, ashamed. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't know. I swear, Alexis, I didn't know. I looked at him, then at Stephanie, alone in the ruins of her vanity. I know, I said. Grab a slice, Mason. It's hot. Stephanie didn't move. She stood amidst the wreckage of her inner circle event, a queen without a court. The invoice lay at her feet, a stark white testament to her deception. She looked at Mason, then at me, her eyes burning with a mixture of humiliation and fury. You think you've won? She hissed, her voice trembling. You think stealing my guests makes you better than me? This is my house, my patio. You're just squatters with a pizza oven. Actually, a gravelly voice interrupted. That's not entirely accurate. Mrs. Patricia stood up from the garden table. She wiped her hands on a napkin, adjusted her silk kimono, and walked to the fence. She didn't look like an eccentric recluse anymore. She looked like a titan. Mrs. Patricia? Stephanie frowned, confusion warring with her anger. What are you talking about? Go back to your hovel. My hovel, Mrs. Patricia said dryly, is the penthouse at the Street Regis. This townhouse? I bought it as a tax write-off. She leaned against the fence, her gaze sharp. My name is Patricia Sterling. I own Sterling Development. Stephanie paled. Everyone in the city knew Sterling Development. They owned half the downtown district. You own this building? Stephanie whispered. I own the whole block, Mrs. Patricia corrected. And I've been reviewing the lease agreements for this property. Specifically, the clause regarding commercial use of residential units. She gestured to the catering setup, the ticketed entry sign that had fallen over, the sheer scale of the event Stephanie had tried to host. You've been using this unit as an event space for your failing business, Mrs. Patricia continued, her voice devoid of sympathy. You've been charging admission. You've been violating noise ordinances, and you've been harassing your neighbors, my other tenants, with frivolous complaints. She looked at me and winked. Then she turned back to Stephanie. I don't rent to bullies, Stephanie, and I certainly don't rent to frauds who don't pay their rent for 3 months. I can pay, Stephanie cried, desperation creeping into her voice. I just need a little more time. The brand is taking off. Your brand, Mrs. Patricia said, is cruelty. And frankly, it's bad for property values. She pulled a folded envelope from her kimono pocket and handed it over the fence to Mason. Eviction notice, she said simply, 30 days. Though, given the state of your finances, I suspect you'll be gone sooner. Stephanie stared at the envelope in Mason's hand. The fight drained out of her. Her shoulders slumped. The facade of the powerful, perfect influencer crumbled, leaving behind a scared, broke woman who had sacrificed everything for an image that wasn't real. Mason, she pleaded, her voice cracking, do something. Mason looked at the eviction notice, then at his sister. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked sad. "I can't fix this, Steph," he said. "I can't afford to fix this." He turned away from her, walked fully into my garden, and sat down next to Haley. He put his arm around our daughter, and for the first time in years, he looked like he was exactly where he belonged. Stephanie stood alone on her gray patio. The string lights I'd hung in the trees cast a warm glow on her face, highlighting the tears tracking down her cheeks. She looked at the party she had tried to destroy: the laughter, the food, the community, and realized too late that she could have been part of it. All she had to do was open the gate. Instead, she had built a wall. And now, she was the only one trapped behind it. 6 weeks later, the "for rent" sign came down yesterday. A nice young couple is moving in next door, artists, who asked if I could teach them how to grow tomatoes. Stephanie moved back in with our in-laws. Mason tells me she's in therapy, trying to figure out why she needed to be better than everyone else to feel okay. We hope she finds peace, but she won't find it here. The fence between the yards is gone. We took it down the weekend Stephanie moved out. Now the garden flows seamlessly from one side to the other. We built a long communal table that spans both properties. Every Sunday, it's full. Neighbors bring dishes. Haley teaches the kids how to make dough. Mrs. Patricia holds court at the head of the table, telling stories about the New York skyline in the 70s. Mason is learning to use the pizza peel, his laugh loud and uninhibited. We didn't need to be exclusive to be special. We didn't need a brand or a VIP list. We just needed warmth. We needed to be real. I looked around my Sunday sanctuary, watching the firelight dance on the faces of the people I love. I realized I didn't fight for a seat at Stephanie's table. I built a warmer one. And everyone was welcome. Sometimes the best revenge is just building a table where everyone is actually welcome. If you've ever had to build your own happiness after being shut out, share your story below. I read every single one.